You're watching News here on Arise News. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has addressed the leaders of the world's 7 wealthiest democracies. They're meeting in Germany to discuss Russia's war with Ukraine and its global repercussions. Zelensky addressed the leaders of Germany, France, the UK, the US, the EU, as well as Canada and Japan virtually. They are in the Bavarian Alps for the second day of 3-day summit, where Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson has sent in this report.
The war in Ukraine has always been front and centre of discussions for this year's G7. World leaders are set to commit to supporting Ukraine in the long haul, with the US promising an advanced surface-to-air missile system to protect the capital, Kiev. Today's virtual conference with Zelensky comes a day after Ukraine was hit by a volley of more than a dozen cruise missiles, including on the capital, sending a clear message, if it were needed, that the country needs urgent help.
There is no deal that the President Zelensky can really do. So in those circumstances, the G7 supporters of Ukraine around the world have to continue to help the Ukrainians to rebuild their economy, to get their grain out, to export their grain. And of course, we have to help them to protect themselves. And that's what we're going to continue to do.
World leaders here at the G7 are on the point of agreeing a price cap on Russian oil, which will help stabilise the oil markets, and also other economic sanctions on Moscow. And that's not all. In a packed agenda today, climate change and how to solve the world food shortage. Whilst millions of tons of export wheat and maize are stuck in silos and ships in Ukraine, millions of Africans, as in Chad, are going hungry because they can't afford soaring prices. G7 leaders are working with the UN to get food moving again. Water levels from recent flooding, thought to be the result of global warming in Bangladesh and India, are receding, highlighting that action to combat carbon emissions mustn't waver. But environmentalists are worried G7 leaders might scale back commitments faced with an energy crisis, which could be solved with greater use of fossil fuels. In one of the most significant G7s in years, never have the world's problems seemed more acute, never so pressing for leaders, several of whom have troubling domestic issues back home. John Cookson, Arise News, at the G7 summit in Bavaria.
For more on the G7 summit, we can cross live to Germany and join Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson for the very latest. John, thanks for that wonderful report. Now, G7 have issued a readout of the conference call with Zelensky. What does it say?
Yeah, they have, and before I come to that, and it's quite long and very, very interesting indeed, let me tell you other news that's developing in the last few minutes, because no official statement has come out on what Zelensky said today, but Ukrainian sources are telling us that he asked G7 leaders for anti-aircraft defense systems to protect cities like Kiev and heavier sanctions against Moscow. So that's what the Ukrainians are saying, although it hasn't come from official sources, just unofficial sources in Kiev. Now, back to that G7 statement. At the top, it says that we are steadfast in our solidarity with Ukraine and reaffirm our commitment to support the government and people in their brave struggle. But later on, halfway down, and we've been talking about this in the last couple of days, there's a very telling statement. It says it's up to Ukraine to decide on a future peace settlement. And then it goes on, with a view to a viable post-war peace settlement, we're ready to make arrangements with interested countries and institutions. Now, could that mean NATO? And we've heard in the last hour that NATO, as we previewed yesterday, has plans to increase its rapid reaction force from over 30,000 to more than 300,000 forces. So profound developments here, I think. G7 suggesting that a peace deal is a good idea. And NATO, on the other hand, and there is a NATO conference starting Tuesday night in Madrid, which some G7 leaders will attend, and Zelensky himself will attend virtually. It seems to be all coming together to look at what might happen after a post-war settlement. And my goodness me, wouldn't that be welcome not only for the people of Ukraine, but also for the rest of the world?
John, how will Russia react to this?
With great interest, I think. More sanctions, I'm sure he expected. And the sanctions that we've been talking about here, or leaders have been talking about here at G7, include a cap on the price of Russian oil and also an embargo on Russian gold. Look, there could have been much stronger sanctions, but what the G7 are worried about is tipping the Russian economy over the top, and no one in the real world wants to see a collapse of the Russian economy. I think, as I said yesterday, in fact, I think Putin will be more interested in developments in Madrid and this NATO conference and this massive increase in NATO troops to be positioned in Eastern Europe. That's where I think Putin's interest will be this time.
All right, John, in your report you mentioned food strategies. Now let's talk about it. Of course, it's on the agenda today. What are we likely to hear on that?
Well, we're likely to hear plans to try to get food moving again out of Ukraine and get the wheat and the maize that's desperately needed, certainly in parts of Africa and elsewhere, including the Middle East, and to try to get the millions of tons that are stuck in silos and ships in Ukraine on the move. Now, they have been shipping millions of tons by rail. Maybe we'll hear more about that later today of an increase in that initiative. But also the UN Secretary General will be taking part in G7 on an internet basis today, on a video conference call. And he is key in trying to get the Bosphorus open. That's the waterway that separates the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and try to lift this Russian blockade of Ukrainian ships.
And climate change, is there a new G7 initiative in the works?
Well, there is. The Americans are proposing a climate club, and what the idea behind that is that interested countries around the world join this so-called club and move to an aspirational point of reducing carbon emissions in the coming years. In the last hour, Japan has said that it wants to eliminate zero emissions from cars from the final communique, which is a significant move by that industrialized country. But the big point about all of this is that you can join as many clubs as you like, but the contributor to a third of all carbon emissions is China, and China has no part in this G7 conference. And would they even be invited to join the club? And if they were invited, would they join? My guess is not.
Well, John Cookson, thank you so much for your analysis and your time this afternoon.